The America's Quarterly podcast is sponsored in part by Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute. Since 1985, the Institute has been at the forefront of innovation in cybersecurity, national security, and public policy. You can dive into their vast library of Latin American security-focused research, explore their academic and professional programs, or tap into their open-source data initiatives. Learn more at go.fiu.edu/impact. Welcome to the America's Quarterly podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Recent scandals involving former President Jair Bolsonaro have left Brazil's conservative movement in a state of flux. What does that mean for the country's politics going forward?
Well, the normalization of Brazilian politics is a slow process. We've had 4 years of very tense political infighting here in Brazil for all sorts of reasons. One, because Bolsonaro was the president, he's a very divisive figure. Two, the pandemic. The pandemic increased a lot polarization in Brazilian society. And Brazilians love social media. Brazilians love X, the former Twitter. Brazilians love to argue about everything. We are a very vocal country, society. There's still a lot of concern here about the way our society deals with politics.
I was in Brazil last week, and I have to tell you, the country felt much calmer, politically speaking, than it has in many years. As I wrote in a recent article for America's Quarterly, after all the tumult and polarization of recent years and the failed insurrection in January, today, democracy no longer feels like it's under severe stress, at least for the moment. President Lula's popularity is somewhere around 60% in polls. The economy isn't great, but should grow a little more than 2% this year. Inflation is back under control. And overall, I heard this sense from business leaders and from everyday people that maybe there are other things to talk and think about besides politics right now. There are several reasons for this new equilibrium, this relative calm. One of them is the troubles of former President Jair Bolsonaro. First, Bolsonaro was banned from holding public office again until 2030 after a panel of Brazilian judges ruled he abused his power by casting doubts about the electronic voting system last year. Now, Bolsonaro is facing a judicial investigation and possibly jail over allegations that he ordered aides to illegally sell jewelry gifted by foreign governments and then tried to pocket the cash for himself. Bolsonaro denies wrongdoing, but the scandal has been incredibly embarrassing for him and for his conservative movement, which has been left in a kind of stunned silence, which is probably one of the reasons why Brazilian politics feels so quiet right now. So today on the AQ podcast, we thought we'd ask whether Bolsonaro is really finished in Brazilian politics, what the conservative opposition looks like in Brazil going forward, and what all this means for President Lula, his economic agenda, and the broader balance of power in Brasília. Our guest, Fábio Zanini, is an editor at Folha de S Paulo who knows the Bolsonaro camp very well. He is a repeat guest here on the show. Fábio, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me again for the second time. It's a pleasure.
So, Fábio, given everything that I just stated in the introduction, here's my question for you. Is this the end of Jair Bolsonaro, politically speaking?
No, it's not the end. Bolsonaro is down, but not dead yet, at least. He's still got enormous political power. He's still the undisputed leader of the right-wing part of the Brazilian electorate. He's still got enormous influence in many political parties. He's got influence in Congress. He's got allies in very important state governments, especially São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro and even Minas Gerais. But of course, Bolsonaro's been going through a very difficult time since he left office some 8 months ago. He's got this political problems, he's got judicial problems, he's been accused of corruption, his family's been accused of misuse of public money. All this together, all these problems, these political problems, these judicial problems, and these corruption accusations mean that Bolsonaro's facing a tough time. He's a smaller political figure that he was, let's say, a year ago. But by any means, he's not finished. He's not dead. We know Brazilian politics are very dynamic, and we can see what happened to President Lula, who was considered to be a spent force and now is back in office for a third time and very strong politically. So, in conclusion, Bolsonaro will have an uphill battle to recover the political strength he used to have. But he's still the leader of the right wing of Brazilian politics, and he still will be a very powerful political person in the years to come.
One thing that has surprised me, and this is something that people outside of Brazil might miss, is how quiet he's been in terms of voicing his opinion on what's happening in day to day politics. I mean, he has criticized Lula, but not nearly to the extent that I expected him to be. Why is that?
Bolsonaro is Bolsonaro and always will be Bolsonaro. So he's not a normal politician, so to speak. But yes, compared to the way he used to communicate and to express his ideas in the past, he's more cautious right now. One of the reasons, of course, is that he's focusing and he's concentrating his mind and his energy on fighting back all these allegations of corruption, all his judicial problems. And we have to understand that Lula has been going through a relatively successful few months. Lula is not the most powerful president ever, of course, but he's got a functional government. He's managed to pass his economic agenda, or a large part of it, in Congress. He's putting his social programs to work. He's been traveling all around the world, so on. So Lula is in a very, I would say, maybe smooth would be a too powerful word, but Lula has had a good first year in office, or a good first month in office. And Bolsonaro, on the contrary, has had a difficult 2023. So Bolsonaro, I think he finally understood that he must lie a bit lower than he used to, and he must now try to regroup and to consolidate his political base in right wing Brazilian politics. And maybe next year, or when Lula's popularity climbs down a bit, and when the Brazilian political cycle turns again, then he'll get back. I have no doubt that Bolsonaro will get back to being Bolsonaro, to being the loud, abusive sometimes Bolsonaro that we've always known for the last few years.
I've heard from sources in the Brazilian conservative movement that one reason that Bolsonaro has been so quiet is because he thinks that it might help him stay out of jail. There have been expectations in the Brazilian press and in Brazilian politics generally the last couple of weeks that jail might still happen anyway. You are speaking, though, as if you don't expect him to end up in prison. It's tough to know, of course, because it depends on what happens in the courts. But what's your baseline expectation right now as an observer of politics? Do you think Bolsonaro and his members of his family will go to prison for this jewelry case or something else in the near future?
Well, I'll have to apologize for sitting on the fence a little bit here. I don't think it's likely, but I don't think it's impossible. What I'm trying to say is this jury case is something that might put Bolsonaro in jail in the future. But with the facts that we have right now, I don't expect it to be enough for Bolsonaro to go to prison in the next weeks. Or, I mean, I might be contradicted by facts maybe tomorrow or next week, but the expectation here is that you need more. You need a little bit more to put Bolsonaro in jail. The main reason for Bolsonaro to go to jail right now if he is a risk to the investigation, if he somehow is trying to derail the investigation and so on. I don't see any reason for that at this time. But we have also to have in mind that in Brazil, these criteria are very flexible, and that in the past, Bolsonaristas and his allies and other politicians, even from the left wing, from the Workers' Party during the Lava Jato, the car wash investigation, went up in jail on flimsy evidence that they were really a danger for the investigation. And we have, I think one thing very clear is that the Supreme Court Minister Alexandre de Moraes, known as AKA Xandão, Big Xande, one of the most, maybe perhaps the most powerful Brazilian at this moment, the guy who is conducting this investigation in the Brazilian Supreme Court. It seems sometimes that step by step, he's slowly building a case and trying to get the Brazilian public opinion used to the notion, to the idea of Bolsonaro ending up in jail. So we can never be sure. So that's why, to sum it up, my take is it's not enough at this moment for him to go to jail, but we can never really discount this possibility.
I want to broaden the lens here in a moment to talk about the general atmosphere in Brasilia right now. But before I do, as an American who follows Brazil closely, there is a question that I cannot resist asking you, which is you must be watching this whole process and making comparisons to the Donald Trump story in the United States in the same way I am. And there have been so many parallels over the last 6 or 7 years, well documented. We've talked about them a lot here on the podcast and in the pages of America's Quarterly. But as a Brazilian who watches politics and specifically Bolsonaro and the conservative movement, what parallels and what differences do you see between the stories in our two countries with these right wing leaders? Their post-presidency specifically.
There are many similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump post-presidency. But I think there is one crucial difference here, which is the projection, the perspective of future power. Trump has been indicted for many reasons, for many accusations in the United States, but he's still able to run for president and he might be elected. So there is a fair chance that Donald Trump will win the next presidential election. It doesn't happen to Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro has, at this moment at least, no way of being elected in 2026, our next election, because he's gone through a trial in the electoral court in Brazil under our legislation. Bolsonaro, he was condemned, he was found guilty of trying to undermine Brazilian democracy, and now he's not allowed to run. So that, of course, diminishes Bolsonaro's political power. But I think there's also one big similarity, that they are still the undisputed leaders of their own camps. The Republican Party, it seems, Donald Trump controls the Republican Party and controls the conservative wing of the American people very clearly, very strongly. Bolsonaro also still has a clear leadership and control of the Brazilian right wing. Bolsonaro will not be a candidate in 26. He will be a supporter. His support will be very, very important for the right wing candidate who will probably face either Lula for another term or Lula's nominee in 2026.
Let me then ask you about the overall political dynamic in Brasilia right now, with Bolsonaro not absent, but quiet, potentially on the ropes, facing legal trouble. His party, his movement seem a little bit stunned to me. I mean, they are certainly relatively quiet, at least by their standards. What has therefore been the atmosphere overall in Brasilia? I mean, where does the opposition to Lula come from? Is it from essentially the Centrão, this block of legislators in Congress that, despite the name, are probably lean right of center in the aggregate? Or does it leave Lula kind of wide open to pursue his agenda more or less how he wants?
Well, that's a great question. Centrão, the center right bloc in Congress, is not really opposed to Lula it more blackmails Lula and wants political positions and wants the amendments and pork barrel money and so on. And Lula is very smartly trying to, I don't like this term, but I cannot find another, buy the political support of Centrão. And he's at this moment reshuffling his government to trying to bring Centrão, more Centrão people to his government. There is Bolsonarista opposition in Congress, which is not, it's not small, it's not negligible, but it is more normalized, it's more institutionalized. You have, let's take the governor of São Paulo, for example, Tarcísio de Freitas, or the governor of Minas Gerais, Romeu Zema. These are opposition governments. They are aligned to Bolsonaro, but there is dialogue with the government of Lula. There is institutional relationship with Lula and his government, something that we didn't see under Bolsonaro. There was just no dialogue, no negotiation under Bolsonaro. Then you have also the street, the Bolsonarista street. You have these activists, you have the social media Bolsonaristas, but these are now, as you said, stunned with what's happening, quieter, more silent than they used to be. And these people function a lot on the commands of Bolsonaro. So if Bolsonaro is quieter, these people are also quieter now. These people, one thing that I think worth mentioning and very interesting is that there used to be a lot of trust on the armed forces, on the military. That there was this expectation, this hope, so to speak, that the armed forces, the military, would never allow the left wing or Lula to get back to power. The communists, the socialists, so to speak, they call the military watermelon because they are green outside and they are red inside. So there's a new development. They feel they have been abandoned by the armed forces and they are taking their time. They're waiting for Bolsonaro to come back again and to give them the order, the command to oppose Lula.
Fabio, what does the conservative movement look like right now outside the Bolsonaro family? Are there any other figures that are worth watching, and how are they different from Bolsonaro himself? I mean, is there anyone who might be able to combine that conservative social and economic agenda with a, I suppose, calmer style of politics that respects institutions a little bit more?
Yes, there are some new kids on the block in the right wing section of the Brazilian politics, and they all need Bolsonaro's blessing. That's the paradox of Brazil right now. I mean, for the right wing, for the conservatives in Brazil, you need a different shape of politics, but you still need the blessing of Bolsonarism, of Bolsonaro. I would mention two of these political figures here: the governor of São Paulo, Tarcísio de Freitas, and the governor of Minas Gerais, Romeu Zema. One of these two will be the candidate in 2026 against Lula or someone from Lula's camp. They are more professional, so to speak. They are more institutional. They tend to govern more and shout less. They are less vicious sometimes, but they are right wing. They are conservative. They believe in a small state. They are for family values, and they are conservative in terms of abortion and drugs and so on. So these are the two I would mention, and they are, in a way, a lighter shade of Bolsonaro, of Bolsonarismo. But that's the paradox, as I mentioned. They will need Bolsonaro's blessing to have any chance of winning the presidency in 2026.
So let's see, with that in mind, if we can build a little bit of a map for people of the true power structure in Brasilia right now. You've got Lula running the executive branch, of course, but as you mentioned, in this delicate negotiation of his cabinet with these members of the Centrão. And then you have this figure who we probably don't focus on enough at America's Quarterly, and that's Arthur Lira, who is this figure from the Centrão, who is the head of the House of Deputies, in some ways the Brazilian version of the US Speaker of the House. Fabio, I've heard people say that he's just as powerful as Lula is, and maybe that's an exaggeration, but this guy has clearly got a lot of power at his fingertips. Can you tell us a little bit about who he is and what he wants?
Well, as you mentioned, he's as powerful as Lula is an exaggeration, but it's not a big exaggeration. He's a very powerful figure. He's the leader of Centrão. Again, Centrão is this roughly this block, which is not very uniform, but it's this coalition of 200 to 250 deputies, which is roughly half of the House, who are very non-ideological, who are only interested in political positions and government jobs and money and so on. And Arthur Lira emerged as the informal leader of this bloc, of this Centrão. And he was elected House Speaker in 2021. He was re-elected this February for another 2 years in this position. And he has a great deal of influence on setting the agenda for the House. He used to be a Bolsonarista. He used to support Bolsonaro in the last government. Now, miraculously, he's shifted towards Lula. He's a solid, very important ally of Lula. He's been very instrumental in the approval of large parts of the economic reform agenda of Lula, tax reform, the new fiscal rule, and other important bills of Lula's agenda in Congress this year. Obviously, he knows how to extract concessions and power from the Lula government. He's got ministers that are his allies. You cannot govern today in Brazil without the support of the House Speaker Arthur Lira, and that is very revealing of the new power of the Brazilian Congress. Maybe this is the most powerful moment for Brazilian Congress in the last since we became a democracy again in 1985.
So my question for you, Fabio, is taking everything you just said for a investor or business audience or even a political audience. What does it mean in practice? Like, does it mean that Lula is going to get what he wants over time? Does it mean that we're going to see the size of the Brazilian state start to grow again through new taxes and new spending or so on? Does Lira act and the Centrão, do they act as a brake on some of Lula's agenda, or will they potentially go along with all of it if the price is right? And by the way, just on that point of the price being right, Lula has been using these so-called emendas parlamentares, literally parliamentary line item spending. This is legal. Bolsonaro also did it, but Lula is doing it to a greater extent, according to several studies, than any Brazilian president has since democracy returns, essentially shoveling money out the door for these legislators' pet projects. But again, Fabio, like, what is the bottom line of this?
Clearly, Lula will not be able to accomplish everything that he wished in Congress. Lula and his allies in the left wing would love to expand the state. They believe in the state. They believe the state public investment is the engine of growth. They're very Keynesian at this point. They believe that you must hire staff for the public sector. You must expand education, money for education, health, social programs, and so on. But we have a Congress, and especially the Chamber of Deputies, that is more center right. I'll give you an example. Lula would like to tax more offshores, to raise more money in taxing offshores, in taxing rich people, offshore accounts, for example, rich people. And clearly, he will not get what he wants on this issue. Congress will put a brake. Maybe we'll try to reach a middle ground with the executive. And the emendas parlamentares that you mentioned, I mean, how to distribute this money from the budget, which is perfectly legal, but sometimes doesn't relate very well to good governance. I mean, it might be legal, but it's not. This money is not necessarily sent to the best projects, to structural projects, but to these pet projects of congressmen. But one thing that's true of Brazilian politics is it is impossible to govern without distributing this money to congressmen. They have this expectation of appropriating some bits of the budget for their pet projects. It is a way of governing. In Brazil, you govern by, you build coalitions less on program and ideology and more on putting people in the right places in the administration and distributing parts of the budget.
One risk that our audience may have thought of as we describe this model is the risk of corruption. And look, I mean, given the past of Lula and the Workers' Party, any hint of a corruption scandal would be politically very difficult for them. I think it's fair to say. How attuned to that risk are you? I mean, how disruptive do you think it could be to politics in Brasilia? I know that we're talking about a hypothetical at this stage, but it seems like a fair one to just ask about.
As political journalists in Brazil, we are always expecting the next scandal. The source of many of these corruption scandals are these emendas. So you distribute this money, and then there are bribes when you employ this money on a pet project in a faraway town or in a faraway state, on a project that doesn't exist, a hospital that's never built, a school that disappears. We've had these scandals throughout Brazilian history. The way Brazilian politics is played, the way you build these coalitions, the way you have to govern, invites these kinds of problems and of corruption scandals.
Another important power center in Brasilia, Fabio, you've mentioned this a bit, but let's talk about it directly, is the military, is the armed forces. Central in the Bolsonaro government, very involved in his cabinet at one point, active duty or retired military composed, I believe it was about a third of his cabinet, occupied hundreds of key positions throughout the federal bureaucracy. Their role came under the microscope again in the aftermath of, well, last year's election and then the January 8th failed insurrection in Brasilia this year when the military was at least seemed slow to respond to that invasion of government buildings. And then Lula fired the head of the army just 2 weeks later. It seemed at that point that the military was going to be kind of a perennial risk or source of instability throughout Lula's government. But as we sit here today, it seems like it's gone pretty quiet. Do you agree with that? And if so, why?
Partially, I agree. Bolsonarismo has somehow entered the military institutions. They have been greatly influenced by Bolsonaro's speeches against, for example, the electoral voting system, his speeches of the so-called threat of communism, of socialism getting back to Brazil. So this golpista, as we say here, feeling was very pervasive in some echelons of the armed forces. One of Lula's priorities after he came to office was to try to stop this feeling and to replace some of the high echelons of the military with more loyal people. And it's an ongoing process. I don't think we have a risk right now of a military coup, but it's still a very difficult and very tense relationship between Lula and the institution, the armed forces. There are discussions of raising the money, the salaries of the military, of investing more in equipment, for example, of Lula trying to make gestures of trying to portray the military as something that he values and he believes are essential to the Brazilian state. But the contamination that happened under Bolsonaro, that's had an effect. And I believe there will be still some time, maybe a few months or maybe a couple of years, so that the situation gets back to normal.
Final question for you here, Fabio. You know, I was in Brazil recently and things felt to me at least almost normal. You mentioned Lula's first two presidencies, and it's clear that we haven't been able to turn back the clock, but I was struck by the degree to which most people who I spoke to wanted to talk about things besides politics, which was very different from the Brazil of recent years, where it felt like that polarization and what people were reading in their WhatsApp groups was like all politics all the time. And the way that that was not the Brazil that I first got to know 20 years ago. Countries like Argentina and Colombia had always been politicized, at least in my mind. But it was relatively recently that this started to prevail in Brazil. And it felt to me when I was there in talking with everyday people, but also people in the political world and the business community, like people had, like they've stood down a little bit, like it's not as tense as it was last year and maybe for several years. But listening to you throughout this conversation, it sounds to me like you're a little bit more concerned. You're saying that actually some of these anti-democratic, anti-institutional impulses are still coursing through the body politic, that Lula still faces these challenges to not just to his agenda, but to governability as a whole. What do you expect essentially for the next 6 to 12 months in Brazil? Something closer to this normal scenario or something that, will continue to be tumultuous?
Well, the normalization of Brazilian politics is a slow process. We've had 4 years of very tense political infighting here in Brazil for all sorts of reasons. One, because Bolsonaro was a president, he's a very divisive figure. Two, the pandemic. The pandemic increased a lot polarization in Brazilian society. And Brazilians love social media. Brazilians love X, the former Twitter. Brazilians love to argue about everything. We are a very vocal country, society. We like to debate everything from football or soccer, the way you call it in the United States, to politics, to soap operas, to everything. So we've been through 4 very difficult years under Bolsonaro, and we are still a very polarized society. It hasn't disappeared. Obviously, 2023 is a much more normal year than 2022 or 21 or 20. And slowly we are getting back to a more civilized form of politics, a more institutional form of politics. The fact that Bolsonaro himself will not be able to come back to the presidency helps, because Bolsonaro, as I said, is very divisive. So when you put Bolsonaro in the picture, it gets tense by default. But yes, there's still a lot of concern here about the way our society deals with politics. Next year, 2024, we will have local elections in Brazil. Polarization will come back. The fight will come back. The election in Sao Paulo city, where I am right now, will put a Lulista against a Bolsonarista, for example. It will be a proxy battle between Lula and Bolsonaro, the two major and towering figures of Brazilian politics at this time. But we are obviously getting to a more normal way of doing politics and of talking. I'm not sure we'll get back to what happened 20 years ago, as you mentioned, but I think it's a slow process, and I hope it stays that way and we don't get back to the craziness of the Bolsonaro years and the polarization that drove us mad here in Brazil.
Fabio, on that note, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks, Brian. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.